My name is Martha Vance, and I believed I had mastered the art of reading people. As a top real estate broker in Chicago's luxury loop, I spent decades deciphering the true intentions of buyers and sellers. But when it came to my daughter Chloe's happiness, I was blind. I poured my heart, my soul, and a staggering $150,000 into her wedding. I wanted every flower, every light, and every silk ribbon to reflect the brightness of her future. The wedding at the historic Drake Hotel was a masterpiece of elegance. I remember watching Chloe in her Vera Wang gown, looking like a dream against the backdrop of Lake Michigan. Julian, her groom, was the picture of success. He was a rising star in finance, charming and attentive. As they danced their first waltz under the crystal chandeliers, I felt a sense of peace. I thought I had secured my daughter's heart in a fortress of love and high society. 4 months later, that peace was shattered by a phone call on a rainy Tuesday. It was Rick, the photographer I had hired for the event. His voice was hushed, vibrating with a nervous energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Martha, I was doing a deep backup of the raw metadata from the wedding drives," he whispered. "I found a sequence of shots from a remote camera I'd forgotten about. You need to see this, and you need to see it alone." I drove to his studio near River North, my mind racing through impossible scenarios. Maybe there was a glitch in the files? Maybe a guest had behaved badly. But when Rick opened the file labeled service_hallway_1402, the air left my lungs. The images were crisp, high-definition betrayals. There was Julian, less than 2 hours before the ceremony. He wasn't adjusting his tie or practicing his vows. He was pinned against a cold concrete wall by a woman. The woman was Tiffany, the wife of one of Julian's biggest investors. In the photos, they weren't just talking. They were entangled in a passionate, desperate embrace. Julian's eyes, which had looked so loving at the altar later that day, were filled with a raw hunger for another man's wife. I watched a slideshow of my daughter's life being stolen in real time. Rick showed me the timestamps. While I was pinning a boutonniere on Julian's lapel, he was this. "There's more, Martha," Rick said, his face pale under the glow of the monitors. He pulled up a secondary folder of text message screenshots he'd recovered from a synced tablet left in the groom's suite. The messages between Julian and Tiffany dated back 2 years. They spoke of a long-term play. They discussed Chloe not as a person, but as a strategic asset. Julian was using our family's reputation and my bank account to fund a shadow life I never suspected. I sat in that dark studio for an hour, staring at the screen until the images burned into my retinas. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. Julian hadn't just cheated. He had conducted a financial and emotional heist. He had convinced Chloe to set up a joint family trust using the wedding gifts and a large inheritance from her late father. He was planning to drain the accounts and move to Miami with Tiffany as soon as the merger was complete. My first instinct was to call Chloe and scream, but a cold, professional instinct stopped me. If I moved too fast, Julian would see the predator coming. He was a snake, and snakes are experts at escaping through small cracks. I needed to be the cage. I paid Rick a significant bonus for his discretion and for a physical copy of every single file. I walked out into the Chicago rain, no longer a grieving mother, but a woman prepared to burn down a kingdom to save her child. I returned to my penthouse and opened my safe. I pulled out the original marriage contract and the trust documents Julian had so helpfully drafted. Reading them now, with the truth in my hands, I saw the traps. He had inserted clauses about uncontested management and discretionary spending that I had overlooked in my joy. I realized that my son-in-law was a professional predator who viewed my daughter as a paycheck. I felt a rage so pure it felt like ice. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window overlooking the city lights, watching the cars go by on Lakeshore Drive. I thought about the thousands of dollars I'd spent on the caviar, the silk drapes, and the 10-piece orchestra. Every cent had been a contribution to Julian's getaway fund. I realized that to win this, I had to let the lie continue for a few more days. I had to look Julian in the eye and smile, all while I sharpened the blade that would end him. The next morning, I arrived at my office at Vance Luxury Realty earlier than usual. My assistant, Sarah, noticed my mood but said nothing. I needed to act normal while I began the process of auditing every transaction Julian had touched. I discovered that he had recommended several vendors for our firm contractors, appraisers, and legal consultants. As I dug into the records, I found a pattern of inflated invoices. Julian wasn't just stealing from the wedding. He was skimming off my business. I spent hours looking at a specific account Julian had insisted on managing for Chloe's future. It was supposed to be a conservative investment portfolio. Instead, I found that the funds were being cycled through a series of shell companies based in Delaware. Each transfer moved the money closer to an account linked to a luxury condo development in Miami. Julian was literally building his future, with Tiffany using my daughter's inheritance as the foundation. The audacity of his theft made my blood boil. I knew I needed professional help. I reached out to an old contact, Mike, a former private investigator who specialized in white-collar crime. We met in a dimly lit diner on the South Side, far from the eyes of our social circle. I handed him the thumb drive from Rick. Mike scanned the files on his rugged laptop, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This isn't just an affair, Martha," he said, tapping a cigarette he didn't light. "This is a long con. He's been prepping this for years." Mike explained that Tiffany's husband, Arthur, was a titan in the Chicago construction industry. Julian had positioned himself as Arthur's golden boy while simultaneously plotting to ruin him. "If Julian pulls this off," Mike warned, "he doesn't just get your money. He leaves Chloe with the debt and Arthur with a massive lawsuit. He's planning to vanish and leave everyone else to take the fall." I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for Chloe's heart, but for our entire family's survival. To keep up appearances, I invited Julian and Chloe for a family Sunday brunch at my home. Watching Julian sit at my mahogany table, sipping expensive coffee and laughing at a joke, was the hardest acting job of my life. He reached out and touched Chloe's hand with such practiced tenderness that it made me physically ill. I looked at his hands, the same hands that were all over Tiffany in that service corridor, and I had to grip my napkin under the table to stop from shaking. "Martha, you seem a bit quiet today," Julian said, his eyes scanning my face with that predatory sharpness he usually hid so well. I forced a smile and adjusted my glasses. "Just hired from the new North Shore listing, Julian. You know how demanding the clients can be." He nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Well, you should let me take some of that pressure off you. I've been looking at the Vance Realty Trust accounts, and I think we can optimize the tax structure." He was already reaching for more. Chloe looked at him with such pride. "He's been so helpful, Mom. Julian really has a vision for our future." Her words felt like a knife in my chest. She was so innocent, so full of the love I had encouraged her to find. I wanted to scream the truth at her right then, to tell her that her husband was a monster. But I knew that a premature confession would ruin our chance at justice. I had to let her stay in the dark just a little longer to ensure she would never be hurt again. After they left, Mike called me with a breakthrough. He had tracked Julian's burner phone to a secret apartment in Gold Coast. "He meets her there every Thursday afternoon," Mike reported. But that's not all. I found a link between Julian and a crooked notary. "They've been forging your signature on power of attorney documents, Martha. He's already started the process of selling your lakefront property behind your back." The scale of his betrayal was growing by the hour. I realized the getaway date was closer than I thought. Julian had booked a private charter to the Bahamas for the following weekend. He told Chloe it was a surprise anniversary trip, even though it was only their 4-month anniversary. In reality, it was the day he planned to settle the offshore accounts and disappear. I had exactly 6 days to intercept the transfers, secure the legal evidence, and break my daughter's heart before he could lead her onto that plane. I spent the next 48 hours in a legal war room with Sarah Miller, my attorney. We worked through the night, drafting the filings that would freeze every asset Julian thought he controlled. We coordinated with the bank managers and the district attorney's office. I was exhausted, living on black coffee and pure adrenaline. I watched the sunrise over the Chicago skyline, knowing that by the end of the week, the man who tried to destroy us would find himself with nothing. The clock on my office wall ticked like a heartbeat as I waited for Chloe to arrive. I had spent the last 6 hours reviewing the forged power of attorney documents with my forensic accountant. Julian hadn't just been greedy, he had been meticulous. He had systematically replaced my signature on dozens of digital filings, creating a paper trail that made it look like I was voluntarily handing him the keys to the Vance empire. The cold efficiency of his theft was a personal insult to everything I had built. When Chloe walked in, she was carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing a bright smile that nearly broke my resolve. "Mom, you looked so stressed at brunch, I thought I'd bring you a treat," she said, setting the cups down on my desk. I looked at her, so full of light and trust, and felt like a monster for what I was about to do. I had to destroy her world to save her future. I took a deep breath and turned my laptop screen toward her. "Honey, we need to talk about Julian, and you need to look at these files." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Chloe's face as she scrolled through the images of Julian and Tiffany in that service corridor. Then she saw the bank transfers, the offshore accounts, and the text messages where Julian called her a useful idiot. She didn't scream. She didn't cry at first. Her skin turned a ghostly shade of gray, and her hands started to tremble so violently that the coffee spilled across my mahogany desk. It was the sound of a heart breaking in real time, and it was agonizing. He said he wanted a big family, Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He talked about names for our children while he was sending our money to her." She looked up at me, and for a second, she looked like the little girl who had fallen off her bike years ago. But then, something shifted in her eyes. The pain didn't vanish, but it was joined by a flash of the Vance temper. She gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles turning white. "He thinks I'm weak. He thinks we're just bank accounts with names." We spent the next 4 hours in a state of focused fury. Chloe went from devastation to a cold, calculated rage that actually surprised me. She started remembering things, small details she had dismissed. Julian taking business calls at 2 a.m., the investment meetings that lasted until dawn, the way he constantly asked about my health and my will. He wasn't waiting for us to grow old together, Mom, she realized. He was waiting for you to die so he could take everything. He's not a husband. He's a parasite. He was waiting for you to die so he could take everything. He's not a husband. He's a parasite. We decided that the anniversary trip to the Bahamas would be his undoing. We wouldn't tell him we knew. Not yet. We needed him to walk into the bank on Friday to make that final, massive transfer he had scheduled. If he did it, it would be a felony wire fraud and interstate theft. Sarah Miller, our lawyer, coordinated with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. We were setting a stage for a grand finale, and Julian was the lead actor who didn't know the script had been rewritten by the women he underestimated. I watched Chloe go home that night, knowing she had to sleep in the same bed as that snake for a few more days. It was the hardest thing I've ever asked of her. But she looked at me and said, "I can do this, Mom. I've been living a lie for months. I can act for 3 more days." She was no longer just my daughter. She was my partner in this war. We were 2 generations of Vance women, and Julian was about to find out exactly what happens when you try to steal from our bloodline. Thursday arrived, and Mike, the private investigator, sent me a final video. It was Julian and Tiffany at their secret Gold Coast apartment, toasting with champagne. "To Miami," Julian said on the recording. "To being finally free of those boring women and their endless real estate talk." Tiffany laughed, a sharp metallic sound that made my skin crawl. They were so confident, so sure of their victory. They had no idea that Arthur, Tiffany's husband, was at that very moment meeting with his own team of lawyers. The plan was in motion. I had to attend a charity gala that evening where Julian and Chloe were also guests. Seeing Julian in his tuxedo, playing the part of the devoted husband, was surreal. He walked up to me and kissed my cheek. "You look beautiful tonight, Martha. Are you excited for the kids' trip tomorrow?" I smiled back, a cold, practiced mask. "Oh, I think tomorrow will be a day none of us ever forget." "Julian, truly," he chuckled, thinking I was just being sentimental. The irony was delicious. That night, I sat in my garden, looking up at the Chicago stars. Tomorrow, the world would know Julian Miller for who he truly was. Tomorrow, the 40 missed calls he would eventually make to Chloe would go unanswered. I thought about the $150,000 wedding and realized it wasn't a waste. It was the price of admission to see a predator get caught in his own trap. I wasn't just protecting my money anymore. I was reclaiming my daughter's soul from the man who tried to buy it with her own fortune. Friday morning in Chicago arrived with a gray, biting wind off the lake. It was the day Julian expected to become a millionaire, and the day we planned to make him a felon. I stood in my kitchen, watching him and Chloe have breakfast one last time. He was checking his watch every 2 minutes, his leg bouncing with nervous excitement. He thought he was anxious about the flight to the Bahamas, but I knew he was vibrating with the anticipation of his final, massive theft. "I have to stop by the bank to authorize the final payment for the island villa, Chloe," Julian said, kissing her forehead. He looked at me with a fake warmth that made my skin crawl. "Martha, thanks again for the anniversary gift. We'll bring you back something special from Nassau." I nodded, holding my coffee cup with both hands to hide my grip. "Oh, I'm sure you will get exactly what you deserve today, Julian," I replied. He smiled, completely missing the edge in my voice. As soon as his car pulled out of the driveway, Chloe collapsed into a chair, her composure finally breaking. "I can't do it anymore, Mom. The way he touches me, knowing he's thinking about her, it's disgusting." I held her for a moment, letting her cry out the last of her grief. "It's almost over, honey. In 2 hours, he won't be able to touch anything that belongs to us ever again." We didn't have time for more tears. We had to get to the bank to meet Sarah Miller and the FBI agents. We arrived at First National Bank 20 minutes before Julian. Sarah Miller had already coordinated with the branch manager, a woman I'd known for years through real estate. We were ushered into a glass-walled office that overlooked the main teller line. 2 plainclothes agents from the Financial Crimes Unit sat with us, their laptops open, monitoring the Van Smiller trust accounts in real time. We were silent, watching the front doors like hunters waiting for a predator to enter the clearing. Julian entered the bank at 10:15 a.m. He looked like the king of the city in his tailored navy suit and designer sunglasses. He walked straight to the premier banking desk, shaking hands with the staff as if he owned the building. We watched on the security monitor as he sat down and pulled out a leather folder, the same folder that contained the forged power of attorney documents. He had no idea that every employee in that room had been briefed on his face and his intentions. "I need to authorize an immediate wire transfer of $400,000 to this offshore routing number," Julian told the banker, his voice loud and confident. On the monitor in our office, we saw the transaction alert pop up on the agent's screen. "There it is," the agent whispered. He just initiated the transfer using a forged digital signature. That's the felony. Once he signs the physical confirmation, we move in. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The banker, playing her role perfectly, frowned at her screen. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller. There seems to be a secondary verification hold on the Vance Trust. We need a second signature from the primary account holder, Martha Vance." Julian didn't panic. He simply reached into his folder. "Actually, I have the power of attorney right here. Martha signed it last week due to her health issues." He slid the forged document across the desk with a smile that was pure poison. That was the moment Chloe couldn't stay in the office anymore. She stood up, straightened her blazer, and walked out into the lobby. I followed her, my heels clicking on the marble floor like a countdown. Julian was leaning back in his chair, looking at his watch, when he heard the sound. He turned around, and the look of confusion on his face slowly morphed into a mask of pure terror as he saw Chloe and me standing there, flanked by two men in dark suits. "Chloe? Martha? What are you doing here?" Julian's voice cracked, and he tried to stand up, but his knees seemed to fail him. Chloe walked right up to him and took the forged document from the banker's hand. She ripped it in half and threw the pieces in his face. "The trip is canceled, Julian, and so is the marriage, and so is your life in this city." He looked around wildly, seeing the security guards closing the exits and the detectives pulling out their badges. "I don't know what you're talking about. This is a misunderstanding," Julian shouted, but his bravado was gone. He looked like a cornered rat. One of the agents stepped forward. "Julian Miller, you are under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. You have the right to remain silent." As they cuffed him in front of the entire bank, he looked at me, his eyes full of a desperate, pathetic plea. I just stared back, as cold as the Chicago winter. As the handcuffs tightened around Julian's wrists, the silence in the bank was absolute. He looked at the crowd of onlookers, his face twisting from shock to a desperate, ugly mask of entitlement. "You're making a mistake," he screamed at the agents. "Martha, tell them! Chloe, honey, talk to them!" But Chloe didn't move an inch. She stood like a statue of justice, watching the man she once loved be dragged toward the revolving doors. I walked over to the banker's desk and picked up Julian's leather folder. Inside, I found more than just the forged power of attorney. There were travel itineraries not for Chloe and Julian, but for Julian and Tiffany. They were headed to a villa in the Maldives after a brief stop in Miami. He hadn't just planned to steal our money. He had planned to celebrate his theft in paradise, while my daughter sat at home wondering why her husband never came back. But we weren't finished with the day's work. While Julian was being processed at the station, Chloe and I drove to the Gold Coast apartment Mike had identified. We knew Tiffany would be there, packing her bags for the Miami flight. We arrived just as a luxury SUV pulled up to the curb. Out stepped Arthur, Tiffany's husband, followed by two of his own security guards. He looked at me and gave a grim nod. "It's time to clean house, Martha," he said. We entered the lobby and headed for the penthouse. When the door opened, Tiffany was standing in the middle of a sea of designer suitcases, holding a silk dress against herself in the mirror. She turned around, expecting Julian. Instead, she saw her husband, the woman whose marriage she helped destroy, and me. The color drained from her face so fast she had to grab the back of a chair to stay upright. Her dream of a tropical escape vanished in a single heartbeat. "Arthur, I can't explain," she began, her voice trembling. But Arthur simply held up a hand. "There's nothing to explain, Tiffany. I've seen the photos from the Drake Hotel. I've seen the wire transfers Julian tried to make into your secret accounts." He looked around the lavish apartment he had paid for. "You have 10 minutes to take what you can carry in one bag. Everything else in this room, the jewelry, the clothes, the furniture, is being seized as part of the divorce filing." Chloe stepped forward, looking Tiffany directly in the eyes. "You called me a useful idiot in your texts, Tiffany. You thought I was too blinded by love to see who Julian really was." Chloe's voice was calm, which made it even more terrifying. "But today, the only person who looks like an idiot is the woman who threw away a life of security for a man who is currently sitting in a holding cell. Julian isn't coming for you. He's going to prison." Tiffany tried to lash out, her desperation turning into venom. "He never loved you, Chloe. He laughed at you every night." But the words had no power anymore. Chloe simply smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "I know he didn't, but I also know he doesn't love you either. He loves money. and now he has none, and neither do you. We walked out of the apartment as Arthur's security began changing the locks. The betrayal was finally being met with a total, crushing consequence. The news of Julian's arrest hit the Chicago social circles like a tidal wave. By Friday evening, my phone had 40 missed calls, all from Julian's lawyer, his family, and his desperate associates. They were looking for a way to settle, to keep the Vance name from being dragged through the mud. But I didn't answer a single one. I sat on my terrace with Chloe, watching the sun set over the lake, feeling the first true breath of freedom we'd had in months. We spent the next week working with the district attorney. The evidence Mike and Rick had provided was so overwhelming that the DA decided to bypass a grand jury and go straight to an indictment. Julian was facing 20 years for multiple counts of felony fraud. As the details of his long con became public, the perfect son-in-law became the most hated man in the city. The wedding of the year had officially become the trial of the decade. I stood in the courtroom during his first hearing, watching him in an orange jumpsuit. He looked small, gray, and pathetic without his tailored suits and expensive watch. He tried to catch my eye, hoping for a flicker of the motherly affection I once felt for him, but there was nothing left but ice. I had spent $150,000 to buy him a wedding, but I would have spent $1 million to see him exactly where he was now. The Vance family was back in control. The trial of Julian Miller became a media sensation in Chicago. Every major news outlet was parked outside the courthouse, waiting for a glimpse of the man who had turned a high society wedding into a criminal enterprise. Julian tried one last desperate tactic. He attempted to blame me, claiming I had pressured him into the marriage and the financial decisions. But Sarah Miller was ready. She produced a series of emails where Julian detailed his plan to bleed the Vance estate dry while I was still alive. The most dramatic moment came when Rick, the photographer, took the stand. He presented the original, unedited photos on a massive screen in the courtroom. Seeing the images of Julian and Tiffany in that service corridor, enlarged for everyone to see, was the final nail in his coffin. The jury didn't just see a cheater. They saw a predator who lacked even a shred of remorse. One of the jurors actually gasped when the timestamp showed Julian was kissing Tiffany while the wedding march was starting to play. Tiffany was called to testify as part of her immunity deal. She looked shattered, stripped of her designer labels and her social status. To save herself from prison, she turned completely against Julian. She admitted that the entire relationship had been a joint effort to secure a retirement fund at our expense. Watching them glare at each other across the courtroom was the ultimate proof that there is no loyalty among thieves. Their grand passion had turned into a bitter fight for survival. The judge didn't hold back during sentencing. "Mr. Miller, you have shown a level of calculated cruelty that is rare even in this court," he said, his voice echoing through the silent room. Julian was sentenced to 12 years in a state penitentiary for grand larceny, wire fraud, and identity theft. He was also ordered to pay full restitution, which meant every asset he had left was liquidated. He walked out of the courtroom in chains, knowing he would spend his prime years in a prison cell. After the trial, the healing process truly began. Chloe and I decided to sell the large house that was filled with so many tainted memories. We moved into a beautiful, light-filled penthouse closer to the lake. It was a fresh start in every sense of the word. Chloe took the remaining wedding funds and donated half to a charity that helps victims of financial abuse. "I want this money to build something good for once, Mom," she told me. I had never been more proud of the woman she had become. Chloe eventually decided to follow her dream of helping others navigate the legal system. She enrolled in law school and became an advocate for women who had been manipulated by emotional predators. Her experience gave her a unique perspective and a fierce determination that made her one of the top students in her class. She was no longer the girl who waited for a prince to save her. She had become the hero of her own story, and the city of Chicago began to take notice. It was during her third year of law school that she met Daniel, He was a structural engineer, a man who valued stability and honesty above all else. Their first date wasn't a lavish gala or a five-star dinner. It was a simple walk through Millennium Park followed by coffee at a small bookstore. Daniel didn't care about the Vance name or our reputation. He cared about Chloe's mind, her laugh, and her resilience. For the first time, I saw my daughter in a relationship built on a solid foundation. As for me, I learned to slow down. I stepped back from the day-to-day operations of Vance Realty and began mentoring young women in the industry. I taught them how to spot a bad deal, both in business and in life. I still think about that rainy afternoon when Rick called me, and I realize how close we came to losing everything. That $150,000 wedding was a hard lesson, but it bought us the truth, and the truth is worth more than any bank account. Today, the sun is shining over Lake Michigan, and I'm sitting on my terrace, watching Chloe and Daniel plan their future. There are no forged documents, no secret offshore accounts, and no red-dressed ghosts in the shadows. We have built a new empire, one made of integrity, courage, and unconditional love. The 40 missed calls from that day are a distant memory now, replaced by the steady, quiet rhythm of a life lived with open eyes and a fearless heart. I look at my daughter, and I see a queen who reclaimed her throne. We didn't just survive the betrayal of Julian Miller. We used the fire of his lies to forge a stronger version of ourselves. If there is one thing I want people to know, it's that your worth isn't defined by who betrays you, but by how you rise from the ashes. We rose, we fought, and we won. And in the end, that is the only story that truly matters. Our legacy is no longer a perfect wedding. It is a perfect victory.